The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Rosa wiped down the grand staircase for the third time that week. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and polishing silver, but she never complained. This job at the Henderson estate was everything to her. It paid for the small room she rented across town, put food on the table, and gave her something most maids didn't have: the ability to bring her son to work. 8-year-old Miguel sat quietly on a wooden stool in the corner of the kitchen, his legs swinging back and forth as he watched the morning light stream through the tall windows. He knew the rules. Stay quiet. Don't touch anything. Don't bother the family. His mother had repeated these words so many times they were burned into his memory. The Henderson house was like a palace to Miguel. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high he had to crane his neck to see them. Paintings in gold frames lined the walls, showing people from long ago in fancy clothes. The carpet was so soft and thick that his feet sank into it whenever he accidentally stepped out of the servants' areas. But none of that interested Miguel as much as the music. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday afternoon, a black car would pull up to the front entrance. An old man with silver hair and round glasses would step out, carrying a leather briefcase. This was Professor Hoffman, and he came to teach piano to the Hendersons' daughter, Catherine. Miguel didn't know much about Catherine. He'd seen her a few times from a distance, a girl about his age with blonde curls and dresses that looked like they cost more than his mother made in a month. She seemed nice enough, though she never really looked at him. To her, he probably wasn't even there. The first time Miguel heard the piano, he was carrying a bucket of water through the hallway. The sound stopped him in his tracks. It was like nothing he'd ever heard before. Each note seemed to float through the air, dancing and twirling before disappearing into silence. He stood there frozen, water sloshing over the bucket's edge, until his mother found him and scolded him for daydreaming. But he couldn't help it. The music called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Over the following weeks, Miguel found ways to be near the music room during Catherine's lessons. He'd volunteer to polish the wooden panels in the hallway outside. He'd offer to water the plants near the doorway. Anything to be close enough to hear Professor Hoffman's patient voice explaining about keys and scales and something called tempo. Sometimes Miguel would press his ear against the wall, closing his eyes and letting the music wash over him. He started to notice patterns, the way certain notes seemed to belong together, how some melodies made him feel happy while others made him feel sad. He didn't have words for what he was learning, but something deep inside him was absorbing every sound. One rainy afternoon, Miguel was helping his mother clean the upper floors of the mansion. The Hendersons were out attending some fancy event, and the house was unusually quiet. His mother sent him to fetch more cleaning supplies from the storage room in the West Wing. The West Wing was the oldest part of the house. The Hendersons rarely used these rooms anymore. Dust covered the furniture, and sheets draped over mysterious shapes like ghosts. Miguel walked slowly down the dim hallway, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. That's when he saw it. Through an open doorway, partly hidden under a white sheet, sat a piano. It was smaller than the grand piano in the music room, and the wood looked dull and scratched. But to Miguel, it might as well have been made of gold. He glanced around. Nobody was there. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped into the room. He knew he shouldn't. He knew the rules. But his feet carried him forward anyway, drawn to the instrument like a moth to a flame. Miguel carefully pulled back the sheet, revealing the full piano. Some of the white keys had yellowed with age, and a few looked chipped. He reached out with one finger and gently pressed a key. The sound that came out was slightly off tune, but to Miguel, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever created. He pressed another key, then another. Each one sang out in the empty room, filling the silence with possibility. He tried to remember the melodies he'd heard Catherine playing. His small fingers moved clumsily across the keys, producing more wrong notes than right ones. But every so often, he'd hit a combination that sounded almost like real music, and his face would light up with joy. Miguel lost track of time. He experimented with different keys, trying to figure out which ones sounded good together. He attempted to recreate simple tunes he'd heard, failing over and over but never giving up. His fingers started to hurt, but he didn't care. Miguel, His mother's voice shattered the moment like breaking glass. He spun around to find Rosa standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear. "What are you doing?" she whispered urgently, rushing into the room. She grabbed his hand and pulled him away from the piano. "Do you have any idea what would happen if the Hendersons found out?" "I'm sorry, Mama. I just wanted to..." "No." Rosa's voice was firm, but her hands were shaking as she covered the piano back up with the sheet. "You listen to me, Miguel. We are guests in this house. We are here because they allow us to be here. We don't touch their things. We don't use their belongings. Do you understand?" Miguel nodded, his eyes stinging with tears. He'd never seen his mother this scared before. Rosa knelt down, taking her son's face in her hands. Her voice softened. "I know you love the music. I see how you listen during the lessons. But this piano, this house, these things, they're not for people like us. If Mr. Henderson found out you touched this piano, he would fire me. And then where would we go? How would we eat?" "I understand, Mama," Miguel said quietly. But deep in his heart, something had awakened that couldn't be put back to sleep. That night, lying on his thin mattress in their small room, Miguel couldn't stop thinking about the piano. He could still feel the smooth keys under his fingers. He could still hear the notes echoing in that dusty room. He closed his eyes and imagined himself playing beautiful music, the kind that made people stop and listen. His mother thought he would forget. She thought the fear of losing their livelihood would be enough to keep him away. But she was wrong, because Miguel had discovered something that day, something more powerful than fear, more important than rules. He had discovered that when he touched those keys, when he made those sounds, he felt like he belonged to something bigger than himself. For those few precious minutes, he wasn't just a maid's son. He was a musician, and that feeling was something he couldn't give up, no matter what the cost. 3 days passed before Miguel returned to the old piano. 3 long days where the music, in his head, grew louder and louder until he thought he might burst. He tried to be good. He tried to forget. But every time he heard Catherine's lessons, every time a melody drifted through the halls, his fingers would twitch with the need to play. He started waking up earlier than his mother. The house was completely silent at 5 in the morning, with only the kitchen staff beginning their day in the basement. Miguel would slip out of the servants' quarters, his bare feet silent on the cold floors, and make his way to the west wing. The first morning, his hands trembled so badly he could barely lift the sheet off the piano. He kept looking over his shoulder, certain someone would appear and catch him. But the house remained still and quiet, holding its breath along with him. He sat on the worn bench and placed his fingers on the keys, trying to remember what he'd figured out before. The notes came out clumsy and disconnected, like broken pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. But he didn't stop. He kept trying, kept searching for the sounds he heard in his mind. Every morning became the same ritual. Wake before dawn, sneak to the west wing, practice until he heard the first stirrings of the household waking. Then race, back to the servants' quarters before his mother noticed he was gone. Miguel's fingers grew sore, then calloused. The old piano keys were stiff and required more pressure than newer instruments. Some mornings his hands ached so much he could barely hold his breakfast spoon. But he never complained. The pain was worth it. He taught himself by listening. During Catherine's lessons, he would memorize everything Professor Hoffman said. When the professor told Catherine to curve her fingers like she was holding an apple, Miguel practiced the same thing on the edge of a table when no one was watching. When the professor explained about playing scales, Miguel would whisper the pattern to himself over and over until he could try it on the piano the next morning. Slowly, impossibly, he began to improve. The random notes started connecting into something that almost sounded like music. He learned which keys were next to each other, how to move his fingers without looking, how to press softly for quiet sounds and firmly for loud ones. One morning, about 3 weeks into his secret practice, Miguel attempted to play a simple melody he'd heard Catherine practicing. It was a children's song, something about a little bird. The first time through, he hit more wrong notes than right ones. The second time was a little better. By the 10th try, something magical happened. The melody came out clear and recognizable. Miguel's eyes widened in wonder. He'd done it. He'd actually played real music. His heart soared, and without thinking, he played it again, this time with more confidence. He didn't hear the footsteps in the hallway. Well. What do we have here? Miguel jumped up so fast he nearly knocked over the piano bench. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Henderson's personal butler, a stern man named Vincent who'd worked for the family for 30 years. Miguel's mouth went dry. This was it. They would be thrown out. His mother would lose her job. All because he couldn't follow simple rules. But Vincent didn't yell. He didn't rush forward to pull Miguel away from the piano. Instead, he stepped into the room, his face unreadable. "How long have you been coming here?" Vincent asked quietly. 3 weeks, Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. Please don't tell my mother. Please don't tell Mr. Henderson. I'll never come back. I promise." Vincent walked closer, studying Miguel with sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "Play something else," he said. "What?" "You heard me. Play something else." Miguel's hands shook as he sat back down. He didn't understand what was happening, but he was too frightened to disobey. He played the only other piece he'd managed to learn, a simple scale that went up and down the keys. When he finished, Vincent stood in silence for a long moment. Then he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. "My mother was a piano player," Vincent said, his voice softer now. "Taught lessons in our home when I was a boy. I know real interest when I see it." He paused, then added, "The Hendersons wake at 7. The house is empty until then. You have until 6:30. After that, you disappear. Understand?" Miguel couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You're not going to tell?" "I didn't see anything," Vincent said simply. "But if you get caught, I can't protect you. Be smart. Be careful." He turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "And boy, that piano needs tuning badly. Try to work around the worst keys until you get better. The ones on the far left sound the most decent." After that morning, Miguel practiced with new purpose. He had an ally now, someone who understood. Vincent would sometimes pause outside the room during Miguel's practice sessions, listening for a moment before continuing on his rounds. He never said much, but occasionally he'd leave small gifts. A book of basic piano exercises he'd found in storage, a cloth to clean the keys, once even a small lamp so Miguel could see better in the dim room. Miguel's progress accelerated. He started recognizing patterns in music, understanding how melodies were built. When he heard a song once, he could usually figure out how to play at least part of it within a few days. It was like learning a new language, and he discovered he had a natural talent for it. Mrs. Henderson began commenting on how dedicated Catherine seemed to be with her practice. "I hear piano music at all hours," she told her husband over breakfast one morning while Miguel was serving tea. "Our daughter is finally taking her lessons seriously." Miguel kept his eyes down and said nothing. Catherine, sitting at the table, looked confused but didn't contradict her mother. She knew she wasn't practicing any extra hours. The weeks turned into months. Fall arrived, painting the estate's gardens in orange and gold. Miguel turned 9 years old, celebrating with a small cake his mother made in the estate kitchen after her shift ended. He didn't tell her what he wanted most for his birthday, more time at the piano. Then one Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. Professor Hoffman arrived 30 minutes early for Catherine's lesson. Mr. Henderson was still at his office in the city. Mrs. Henderson was at a ladies' luncheon across town. The house was in that quiet in-between time when most of the staff were preparing for the evening routine. Professor Hoffman let himself in, as he'd done countless times before. He set down his briefcase in the entrance hall and was about to head to the music room when he heard something that made him stop cold. Someone was playing Chopin. Not just playing it, feeling it. The notes filled the air with emotion that no beginning student could fake. It was raw and imperfect, with timing that wavered and techniques that were self-taught and unconventional. But underneath the technical flaws was something the professor hadn't heard in years of teaching. Pure, undeniable talent. He followed the sound through the hallways, past the main rooms toward the forgotten West Wing. The music grew louder with each step. His heart began to pound because he knew Catherine couldn't play like this. She was a dutiful student with moderate ability, nothing more. So who was in that room? Professor Hoffman reached the doorway and looked inside. There at the old upright piano sat a small boy with dark hair and clothes that were clean but well worn. The boy's eyes were closed, his fingers dancing across the yellowed keys, completely lost in the music. The professor stood frozen, watching this impossible scene unfold before him. He recognized the piece. It was something he'd taught Catherine just last week. But this boy was playing it from memory, with feeling that suggested he understood the story behind the notes. When the music ended, the silence felt heavy. Miguel opened his eyes and happened to glance toward the door. Their eyes met, and in that moment both of them knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Miguel's first instinct was to run. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to jump up and flee from the room. But his legs wouldn't move. He sat frozen on the piano bench, staring at the old man in the doorway like a rabbit caught in a trap. Professor Hoffman took a slow step into the room. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between shock and curiosity. He studied Miguel for a long moment, then spoke in a gentle voice that surprised them both. That was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Where did you learn to play it? Miguel's throat felt tight. I heard you teaching it. To Miss Catherine. Last week. You learned that by listening once? Miguel nodded, unable to speak. The professor walked closer, his eyes never leaving Miguel's face. Do you know how to read music? No, sir. Has anyone taught you to play? No, sir. Professor Hoffman let out a long, slow breath. He pulled up an old chair and sat down, gesturing for Miguel to remain at the piano. Play something else for me. Anything you know. I shouldn't be here, Miguel whispered. My mother, she'll lose her job if... Right now, I'm not interested in rules. The professor interrupted gently. Right now, I want to hear you play, please. With trembling hands, Miguel turned back to the piano. He chose a simpler piece, one of the first melodies he'd fully mastered. His fingers felt clumsy under the professor's gaze, and he made several mistakes. But he pushed through, finishing the short piece. When he looked up, Professor Hoffman's eyes were glistening with something that looked like tears. Remarkable, the professor murmured. Absolutely remarkable. He leaned forward. What's your name, son? Miguel, sir. My mother is Mrs. Rosa. She works here as... I know who your mother is, Professor Hoffman said kindly. Tell me, Miguel, how long have you been playing? About 4 months, sir. I come early in the mornings before anyone wakes up. I know I shouldn't, but I couldn't help it. The music, it just... Miguel struggled to find the words. It's like I need it. Like breathing. The professor nodded slowly as if Miguel had just confirmed something he suspected. You have a gift, Miguel. A very rare gift. Your technique is rough, yes. You have bad habits that need correcting. But the way you feel the music, the way you interpret it, that cannot be taught. You either have it or you don't. Miguel's heart was pounding. He couldn't tell if he was about to be praised or punished. Wait here, Professor Hoffman said, standing up. Don't move. I'll return shortly. The professor left the room and Miguel sat in agonizing uncertainty. Minutes felt like hours. He considered running, but where would he go? His mother was somewhere in the house, working. They had nowhere else. Voices echoed from down the hallway. Professor Hoffman was talking to someone. No, several people. Miguel's stomach twisted into knots. Then they appeared in the doorway. Professor Hoffman, Mrs. Henderson, and Vincent the butler. Mrs. Henderson's face was a mixture of anger and confusion. This is absurd, Professor, she was saying. You're telling me that the maid's child has been sneaking around my house using our piano without permission, and you want to... I want you to listen to him play, Professor Hoffman said firmly. Just once, then we can discuss what should be done. Mrs. Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at Miguel like he was something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. Fine. Play something, boy, quickly. Miguel's hands shook so badly he could barely position them on the keys. This was it. After this, they would be thrown out. He'd ruined everything for his mother, all because he couldn't stay away from the piano. He closed his eyes, trying to block out Mrs. Henderson's cold stare. He thought about his mother, how hard she worked, how much she sacrificed for him. And he played. He chose the piece he loved most, a gentle melody that reminded him of rain falling on windows. He poured everything into it, all his fear, all his hope, all his desperate love for music. His fingers found the keys as if they'd been playing together for a lifetime. When the last note faded, the room was silent. Miguel opened his eyes. Mrs. Henderson's expression had changed. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Surprise, maybe? Or confusion. He's completely self-taught, Professor Hoffman said quietly. No lessons, no books. Just listening and practicing on that old piano. In 4 months, he's achieved what takes most students years to accomplish. It's still theft, Mrs. Henderson said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. Using our property without permission. It sets a terrible precedent for the other servants. I understand your concern, the professor replied, but what I'm suggesting would solve that problem. He paused. The Henderson family hosts a charity gala every year, correct? It's 3 weeks away. Yes, but I don't see what Catherine always performs at the gala. It's tradition. But this year I propose something different. Something that will be remembered long after the evening ends. Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you proposing? Let Miguel perform as well. Just one piece before Catherine's usual recital. If he can play adequately in front of your guests, I will personally sponsor his musical education. Full scholarship. He'll study under my guidance free of charge. Absolutely not, Mrs. Henderson said immediately. The guests are expecting a refined evening, not some servant's son stumbling through. And if he fails? Professor Hoffman continued, speaking over her objection. If he cannot perform to an acceptable standard, then he will stop playing entirely. No more practice, no more sneaking around. Rosa keeps her position and the matter is closed forever. Miguel's breath caught. The professor was gambling everything on a single performance, in front of a room full of wealthy strangers. People who would judge him before he played a single note. Mrs. Henderson considered this. Miguel could see her mind working, weighing the options. Finally, she turned to Vincent. You knew about this, she said. It wasn't a question. Vincent met her gaze steadily. I did, ma'am. Why didn't you report it? Because, Vincent said carefully, in 30 years of service to this family, I've learned that some rules exist to protect what matters, and some rules exist simply to remind people of their place. I thought this fell into the former category. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. She looked back at Miguel, really looked at him for the first time. Then she sighed. 3 weeks. The boy has 3 weeks to prepare. Professor Hoffman, you will work with him during Catherine's regular lesson times. She can practice on her own for once. She fixed Miguel with a stern gaze. But understand this, young man. If you embarrass this family, if you make a mockery of our charity event, your mother will be dismissed immediately. Those are the terms. Do you accept? Miguel thought about what he was risking. His mother's job, their home, their future. One mistake, one moment of stage fright, one wrong note at the wrong time, and it would all be over. But he also thought about the music, about the way it made him feel when his fingers touched the keys, about the possibility of learning from someone like Professor Hoffman, of maybe someday becoming a real pianist. I accept, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. Then it settled. Professor Hoffman said, a smile breaking across his face. We begin tomorrow. And Miguel? The professor's eyes twinkled. Prepare yourself. The next 3 weeks will be the hardest work you've ever done. As they left the room, Miguel sat alone at the piano, his heart racing. He didn't know it yet, but word of the challenge was already beginning to spread through the household staff. The cook told the gardener. The gardener told the driver. By evening, half the servants knew that Rosa's boy would be performing at the Hendersons' fancy gala. And by the following morning, when Mr. Henderson casually mentioned it to his business partners, the news began spreading through the city's upper circles as well. The Maid's son was going to play piano at the Henderson estate. How delightfully amusing. How perfectly ridiculous. They couldn't wait to see him fail. The 3 weeks that followed were the most intense of Miguel's young life. Every afternoon when Professor Hoffman arrived for Catherine's lesson, he would spend the first hour with Miguel instead. Catherine didn't seem to mind. She'd grown curious about the boy who could play by ear and often stayed to watch, sitting quietly in the corner of the music room. The professor worked Miguel harder than he'd ever been worked before. They started with the basics, proper posture, correct hand position, finger exercises that made Miguel's hands cramp. The professor would tap Miguel's wrists with a pencil whenever they dropped too low. He'd make him play scales over and over until they were smooth and even. You've taught yourself to play from your heart, Professor Hoffman would say. Now I'm teaching you to play with your mind as well. Both are necessary, They chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata for the performance. The professor said it was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for someone with only months of training. But he also said that Miguel had something in his playing that suited the piece perfectly. "This music is about longing," the professor explained one afternoon. "About reaching for something that feels just out of grasp. You understand that feeling, don't you, Miguel?" Miguel nodded. He understood it all too well. Rosa watched her son's transformation with mixed feelings. She was proud, terrified, and angry all at once. She hadn't known about the secret practice sessions until Mrs. Henderson had called her into the office to explain the arrangement. Rosa had stood there listening in stunned silence as her employer described the challenge her son had accepted. That night, Rosa had held Miguel's face in her hands and asked him why. Why would he risk everything they had for music? "Because, Mama," Miguel had said softly, "when I play I feel like I matter. Like I'm more than just someone people look past. Does that make sense?" Rosa's eyes had filled with tears. She understood more than Miguel knew. She'd spent years being invisible in this house, just another servant in the background, and now her son had a chance to be seen, really seen, even if just for one night. The day of the gala arrived cold and clear. The Henderson estate transformed into something magical. White lights wrapped around every tree and pillar. Flowers filled every room with perfume. Staff rushed about making final preparations while the kitchen worked on a feast fit for 100 guests. Miguel spent the morning trying not to throw up. His stomach churned with nerves. His hands felt sweaty and clumsy. What if he forgot the notes? What if his finger slipped? What if everyone laughed? Vincent found him hiding in the servants' quarters an hour before the performance. The old butler sat down beside him without a word, just keeping him company. After a while he spoke. "My mother used to say that fear and excitement feel the same in your body. Racing heart, sweaty palms, butterflies in your stomach. The only difference is what you tell yourself about what you're feeling." "What do you mean?" Miguel asked. "You can tell yourself you're scared and you'll probably fail. Or you can tell yourself you're excited and something amazing is about to happen. Same feeling, different story." Miguel thought about that. "What if I mess up?" "Then you mess up," Vincent said simply. "But at least you'll know you tried." Most people never get that far. As evening approached, guests began arriving in fancy cars and elegant clothes. Women wore gowns that sparkled under the lights. Men wore sharp suits and polished shoes. They sipped champagne and chatted about business deals and vacation homes and things Miguel couldn't even imagine. Rosa had borrowed a suit for Miguel from one of the Hendersons' nephews. It was slightly too big, the sleeves hanging past his wrists, the pants pooling at his ankles. She'd tried to adjust it as best she could, but Miguel still felt like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes. Professor Hoffman found them backstage as the guests were being seated. He put a hand on Miguel's shoulder. "Remember what we practiced. Don't rush. Let the music breathe. And most importantly, play for yourself, not for them. Play like you did that first morning when you thought no one was listening." Miguel nodded, though he could barely hear over the sound of his own heartbeat. The ballroom filled with the city's wealthy elite. Mr. Henderson stood at the front of the room, welcoming everyone and thanking them for their generous donations to the Children's Hospital. He spoke about the importance of supporting the arts and giving back to the community. Then he paused, his expression difficult to read. "Tonight, before Catherine's performance, we have a special, unusual presentation. A young performer will play a selection for you." He didn't mention Miguel's name. He didn't explain who the performer was. The vague introduction left the guests curious and confused. When Miguel walked onto the small stage, the room fell silent in a different way. Not the respectful silence of anticipation, but the stunned silence of complete surprise. A woman near the front whispered loudly to her companion, "Is that the Hendersons' Maid's boy?" The whisper spread like wildfire. Miguel heard fragments of conversation. "Servant's child. What is Henderson thinking? This is ridiculous." Then the laughter started. Not loud, mocking laughter at first, but the kind of amused chuckling that comes from people who think they're witnessing something absurd. A few people smiled behind their hands. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Miguel stood by the piano bench, frozen. The sea of faces before him blurred together. He could feel their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on him. These people had already decided who he was before he played a single note. To them he was just a maid's son, someone who didn't belong on that stage, someone who was about to embarrass himself. He looked toward the side of the room where his mother stood with the other servants. Rosa's hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes met his, and in them, he saw everything: her fear, her hope, her fierce love. Beside her, Vincent gave him the smallest nod. Near the back, Professor Hoffman stood with his arms crossed, waiting, and at a table near the front, Catherine sat between her parents, leaning forward slightly, genuinely curious about what would happen next. Miguel took a deep breath. His hands were shaking as he sat down at the grand piano. It was much finer than the old upright he'd learned on. The keys were smooth and perfectly tuned. It felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. The whispers continued. Someone coughed. Another person laughed softly. Miguel closed his eyes and let the noise fade away. He thought about those early mornings in the West Wing, when it was just him and the piano and the music. He thought about why he played in the first place, not for approval or recognition, but because the music was part of him. He placed his fingers on the keys. The room remained noisy, people still talking amongst themselves, not even giving him the courtesy of silence. Then Miguel began to play. The first notes of the Moonlight Sonata floated through the ballroom, soft and haunting. The opening movement was meant to be played like a funeral march, slow and somber, each note holding its own weight. The conversations began to die down. One by one, people stopped talking and turned their attention to the stage. The laughter faded. The mocking smiles disappeared, because what they heard wasn't what they expected. Miguel didn't play like a child showing off newly learned skills. He didn't play like a student carefully executing memorized patterns. He played like someone who understood what the music meant. His fingers moved across the keys with a combination of technical precision and raw emotion that shouldn't have been possible for someone his age, someone with his training. The second movement built with urgency, his hands dancing across the keys faster now, the notes tumbling over each other like water rushing downstream. He'd practiced this section hundreds of times, until his fingers knew every turn and leap without thinking. But it was the third movement that changed everything. The final section of the Moonlight Sonata is intense and demanding, requiring speed and power and absolute control. Miguel's small hands stretched to reach the wide chords. His arms moved with fierce determination. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Every muscle in his body was focused on this moment, this music, this chance to show the world who he truly was. The music swelled and crashed like storm waves against rocks. It spoke of struggle and beauty and refusing to give up. It spoke of a boy who'd woken before dawn for months just to touch piano keys. It spoke of dreams that were too big to fit in the small spaces the world tried to assign them. And then, as the final notes rang out, Miguel's hands lifted from the keys. Silence. Complete. Absolute silence. Miguel opened his eyes, his chest heaving, suddenly aware of the room again. Had he made a mistake? Had he ruined everything? He looked out at the audience and saw something he never expected. Tears. On dozens of faces throughout the ballroom, tears were streaming down cheeks. A woman in the front row had her hand pressed to her mouth. A man in an expensive suit was openly weeping. Catherine's mother sat with her eyes wide, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. Then, from the back of the room, one person began to clap, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. People rose to their feet. The sound washed over Miguel like a wave, overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. He'd done it. Against every odd, every expectation, every person who'd laughed at the idea of a maid son challenging a pianist. He'd actually done it. Miguel stood and bowed, his legs shaking, his vision blurry with tears he was trying not to shed. And as he left the stage, he finally let himself look at his mother. Rosa stood with tears running freely down her face, her hand over her heart, watching her son with an expression of pure pride and love. Professor Hoffman was already making his way toward them, his face split with the widest smile Miguel had ever seen, and the applause continued, rolling on and on, refusing to stop. The applause seemed to go on forever. Miguel stood in the wings of the stage, his whole body trembling as the sound washed over him. He'd never heard anything like it. The same people who'd laughed at him minutes earlier were now on their feet, clapping so hard their hands must have hurt. Professor Hoffman reached Miguel first, pulling him into a tight embrace. The old man's shoulders shook and Miguel realized he was crying. That was extraordinary, the professor whispered. In 40 years of teaching, I've never heard anything quite like that. Rosa pushed through the crowd of servants who'd gathered to watch. She grabbed her son and held him so tight he could barely breathe. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Miguel felt everything in that embrace. Her fear, her relief, her overwhelming pride. Mr. Henderson approached them, his expression unreadable. The ballroom had begun to settle down, though people were still talking excitedly amongst themselves. He looked at Miguel for a long moment, then extended his hand. That was unexpected, he said slowly. I admit I had my doubts. But you've proven me wrong, young man. Well done. Miguel shook his hand, barely believing this was happening. Mrs. Henderson stood nearby, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Professor Hoffman, she said, her voice thick with emotion. About that scholarship you mentioned. It stands, the professor said firmly. Starting Monday, Miguel will begin formal lessons. 3 times a week, just like Catherine. I'll provide all the materials he needs. Actually, Mr. Henderson interrupted, I think we can do better than that. He gestured around the ballroom. Look at these people. They're moved. They're inspired. They came here expecting a pleasant evening and a tax deduction. Instead, they witnessed something real. He turned to Miguel. What you did tonight, son, wasn't just impressive playing. You reminded everyone in this room that talent and passion don't care about circumstances. They don't care if you're rich or poor, whether you live in a mansion or a small room across town. Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. Guest after guest approached Miguel. Some wanted to shake his hand. Others wanted to tell him how the music had moved them. A woman named Mrs. Chen, who owned a chain of music stores across the city, offered to donate a piano for Miguel to keep at home. Every musician needs their own instrument, she said with a kind smile. I'll have one delivered this week. A businessman named Mr. Rodriguez pulled Professor Hoffman aside. That scholarship you mentioned, how much does it cost to train a student like that? I want to contribute, and I know others who will too. By the end of the evening, something bigger had taken shape. The guests, inspired by what they'd witnessed, decided to create a fund. Not just for Miguel, but for other children like him. Children with talent, but no means to develop it. Children who might never get the chance to discover their gifts. They called it the Henderson Music Foundation, though Mr. Henderson insisted it wasn't his idea. This was all them, he said, gesturing to Miguel and Professor Hoffman. We're just making it possible. Catherine approached Miguel as the guests were beginning to leave. She'd been quiet most of the evening, watching everything unfold from the sidelines. That was really good, she said simply. Better than I could ever play. Miguel didn't know what to say. You're a good player too. Your lessons helped me learn. I listened to everything Professor Hoffman taught you. Catherine smiled. Maybe we could practice together sometimes. If you want. I'd like that, Miguel said. As the last guest departed, Miguel and his mother walked home through the quiet streets. The borrowed suit felt different now. Not like something too big that didn't fit, but like armor he'd worn into battle and emerged victorious. What happens now? Miguel asked quietly. Rosa was silent for a moment. Now you work harder than you've ever worked before. This gift you have, it's just the beginning. Professor Hoffman will teach you properly. You'll learn to read music, to understand theory. All the things you've been missing. It won't be easy. I know, Mama, but you'll also still be my son. You'll still have chores. You'll still have responsibilities. This doesn't change who you are or where you come from. Don't forget that. I won't, Miguel promised. The following Monday, Miguel began his formal lessons. Professor Hoffman was even more demanding than before, now that they had time and permission to work properly. He corrected years of self-taught habits, rebuilding Miguel's technique from the ground up. Unlearning bad habits is harder than learning correctly the first time, the professor would say whenever Miguel got frustrated. But you're strong enough to do it. Miguel practiced for hours every day. The donated piano arrived, a beautiful upright that fit perfectly in the small room he shared with his mother. It wasn't as grand as the ones in the Henderson estate, but to Miguel it was the most precious thing he'd ever owned. Word of his performance spread throughout the city. A local newspaper ran a story titled "From Servants' Quarters to Standing Ovation." The article talked about talent hidden in unexpected places, about the importance of giving everyone a chance. The Henderson Music Foundation grew quickly. Within months, they'd identified 12 children from low-income families with musical talent. They provided instruments, lessons, and opportunities. Miguel wasn't special anymore, he was the first of many. Years passed. Miguel's skill developed far beyond what anyone could have imagined. By the time he was 16, he was performing in concert halls across the state. By 20, he'd played in venues that most musicians only dreamed of, but he never forgot where he came from. On his 25th birthday, Miguel returned to the Henderson estate for a special performance. The family had maintained their support throughout the years, and the foundation had grown to help hundreds of young musicians. The old West Wing piano was still there, now lovingly restored and maintained. Miguel sat at it before the performance, running his fingers over keys he'd first touched as a scared 8-year-old boy. Vincent, now retired but still living on the estate grounds, came to visit him. "You know," the old butler said, "I always believed in you. Even that first morning when I caught you playing, why?" Miguel asked. "Most people would have just reported me," Vincent smiled, "because I saw the same look in your eyes that my mother used to have when she played. That hunger for something more than what life handed you. That can't be taught. That's something you're born with." The evening performance was different from that first gala. This time Miguel played as an accomplished musician, not a nervous child. But he chose the same piece, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. "This is where it all began," he told the audience before playing. "In this house, on an old out-of-tune piano, a scared little boy discovered who he really was. I play this tonight to remind myself, and hopefully you, that extraordinary things can come from the most ordinary circumstances." The audience included many of the same people who'd attended that first gala. They were older now, grayer, but they remembered. Some still talked about that night as one of the most moving experiences of their lives. After the performance, Miguel stood with Professor Hoffman, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever. "I'm opening a music school," Miguel announced, "in the neighborhood where my mother and I used to live. Free lessons for any child who wants to learn, regardless of their circumstances." The professor's eyes glistened. "Your mother would be proud." Rosa had passed away 2 years earlier, but not before seeing her son achieve everything she'd hoped for him and more. She'd attended every performance she could, sitting in the audience with tears of pride streaming down her face. "She already was proud," Miguel said softly. "She was proud before any of this happened. That's what I want to give these kids, not just music lessons, but the feeling that they matter. That their dreams are valid, even if the world tells them otherwise." The school opened 6 months later. On the first day, Miguel stood in the doorway watching children file in, children of all backgrounds, all circumstances, all carrying their own dreams. One small girl with worn shoes and patched clothes hung back. Looking uncertain, Miguel knelt down to her level. "Have you ever played piano before?" She shook her head. "Would you like to try?" Her face lit up with hope. "Really, I'm allowed?" Miguel smiled, remembering another child who'd asked similar questions years ago. "Of course. Everyone's allowed. Come on, I'll show you." As he led her to the piano, Miguel thought about that morning when he'd first discovered the old instrument in the Hendersons' West Wing. He thought about the fear, the struggle, the moment of triumph when he'd proven everyone wrong. But mostly, he thought about how one chance, one person believing in you, one moment of courage could change everything. The girl pressed her first note on the piano, her eyes widening with wonder at the sound, and Miguel knew that somehow, his mother was smiling because the music would continue. The dream would live on, and somewhere in that room full of hopeful children, there might be another scared kid who just needed someone to believe in them. That's what this was all about. Not fame or fortune or proving anything to anyone. It was about making sure that every child who heard music in their heart got the chance to let it out into the world, just like a Maid's son once did, on a night when they all laughed until he made his first step.